Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is Peace Conference, Round 1. The year is 1918. World War I has come to an end. The armistice is set, and it was time to take stock for just a moment on the devastation that this war had wrought. 10 million people roughly were killed, about 6 million on the side of the Allies, about 4 million on the side of the Central Powers, and many, many more were wounded. Some additional 20 million were wounded in this conflict. Never before in the history of the world did something like this happen, and for Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, his goal was to make sure it never happened again. That was the purpose of his 14 points, including the League of Nations. There was a little bit of controversy right out of the gate, though, as the nations on the Allied side were getting ready to come to France for the peace conference. In particular, who would lead the American delegation? In Europe, you have a monarch typically as the head of state and the prime minister as head of government. And it was the prime ministers that were all going to be showing up to negotiate the final peace conference. And they thought it would be out of balance for an American president to show up. Why? Well, in the U.S. system, the president is both head of government and head of state. And since no other heads of state were going to be present at the peace conference, Woodrow Wilson was encouraged, frankly, to stay home. Well, that was not going to happen with Woodrow Wilson. Even though no American president had ever gone on a mission like this in person before, he made it clear that I owe it to the American soldiers to see to it. So far as in me lies that no false or mistaken interpretation is put upon them and no possible effort admitted to realize them. I am determined to play my full part in making good what they offered their life's blood to attain. Woodrow Wilson would attend in person. In fact, he was making this essentially his mission in life, world peace, to prevent wars. He was the chosen one in many ways to deliver on this message through his League of Nations, the international mechanism to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. That was his mindset as he was heading over to France. His problem was not going to really be the Germans or the Central Powers. They were frankly anxious to accept Wilson's 14 points, which they deemed to be reasonably fair, balanced. The challenge was going to be the Allies. Too many of the Allies wanted to crush the enemy, to crush the Germans, crippling reparations and other terms. That was going to be the major challenge for Woodrow Wilson. He had to pick his delegation. In addition to himself, he wanted unity behind him. He went with his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, as a member. General Tasker Bliss, who was the Army Chief of Staff, would represent the military interests. Colonel Edward House, who had always been the unofficial envoy of Woodrow Wilson, was getting an official role for the first time. He would be part of the commission as well. And then there was an opening for one more spot, perhaps a Republican. In fact, many were urging that Wilson consider a member of the Senate, a Republican, to come because the Senate, which now had a majority the Republicans, which had a majority in the Senate, they were going to be needed to ratify any agreement that the president negotiated. But Woodrow Wilson didn't seem to be concerned by this. As a political scientist and the president of Princeton University back in 1908, he talked about this very issue. One of the greatest of the president's powers I have not yet spoken of at all, his control, which is very absolute, of the foreign relations of the nation. The initiative in foreign affairs, which the president possesses without any restriction whatever, is virtually the power to control them absolutely. He, the president, need disclose no step of negotiation until it is complete, and when in any critical matter it is completed, the government is virtually committed. Whatever its disinclination, the Senate may feel itself committed also. Interesting perspective, given that the Senate had often been very difficult in ratifying treaties negotiated by the executive in American history. In fact, 14 times they had rejected such treaties. But this was not fathomable at the time to Woodrow Wilson. This was too important. This was too big a deal. He would negotiate. He was confident the Senate would go along. So he did pick a Republican to be on his delegation, but it was one with very little influence actually in the party. It was an ambassador by the name of Henry White. He believed that with unity of effort behind him, he would negotiate the best deal and the Senate would go along. Kind of hard for him to figure out why he's thinking this, because this critical decision rested in large part on Henry Cabot Lodge, who was now going to be the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge had previously supported a concept called the League to Enforce Peace, very similar to Wilson's League of Nations, but he had pretty much changed his mind. And now, as Wilson is about to go to Europe, Lodge is already coming out kind of against this notion that Wilson had introduced in his 14 points. But there were other Republicans who were in favor of it, and in fact still had a lot of influence on the party. People like former President William Taft or former Senator Elihu Root, both of whom were very committed to Wilson's League of Nations, both of whom had a lot of influence perhaps in the Republican Party, both of whom were considered by Wilson for his delegation, according to Joe Tumulty, his secretary, but Wilson rejected both. He believed he didn't have to worry about this, that he would negotiate the best deal, and the Senate would simply go along. He was moving forward, though, at his own peril. Well, Wilson and his entourage got on the George Washington, the USS naval vessel that took them off to France, and when they got there, they had receptions unlike almost anyone had ever seen. Nothing like this had been seen before. Wilson was hailed as the savior, essentially, of mankind, starting in Paris, where millions showed up to line the streets to welcome the American president. According to William Bolitho of the New York World, no one has ever heard such cheers. I, who heard them in the streets of Paris, can never forget them in my life. I saw folk pass, Clemenceau pass, Lloyd George, generals, returning troops, banners, but Wilson heard from his carriage something different, inhuman or superhuman. It was a quick trip to Great Britain then for Wilson, as he got a similar reaction. Then it was off to Italy. This was probably the biggest reception of all. According to Secret Service agent Edmund Starling, the reception in Rome exceeded anything I have ever seen in all my years of witnessing public demonstrations. The people literally hailed the president as a god, the god of peace. Now, Wilson was calm enough about this in a moment to try to put it in perspective. He told his doctor, Dr. Grayson, after that reception in Rome, that there's bound to be a reaction to this sort of thing. I'm now at the apex of my glory in the hearts of these people, but they're thinking of me only as one who has come to save Italy. And I've got to pool the interests of Italy with the interests of all the world. And when I do that, I'm afraid they're going to be disappointed and turn about and hiss me. And he would be correct. Well, the peace conference finally began on January the 18th of 1919. 70 delegates coming from 30 different countries. The Allies only, the Central Powers, were not represented. They would simply be called when it was time to impose the terms of the agreement on those Central Powers. Of all those delegates, though, really only 4 really mattered. The big 4 were the prime ministers, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and then on the president's side, it was the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, being number 4. The first 3 really were focused on revenge against Germany and their own self-interest. Woodrow Wilson was there to prevent future wars. Bound to be conflict in these different perspectives. At the second plenary session of the gathering was the first real business, and Woodrow Wilson was center stage, where he introduced the concept of his League of Nations, his 14th point. This was the key to everything, in part because Wilson knew he wasn't going to be able to get everything solved here at the peace conference, and they needed a mechanism to try to fix and improve upon what was agreed to and maintain it over time. Wilson said to Edith, his wife, that once established, the League can arbitrate and correct mistakes which are inevitable in the treaty we're trying to make at this time. The resentments and injustices caused by the war are still too poignant, and the wounds too fresh. They must have time to heal, and when they have done so, one by one, the mistakes can be brought to the League for readjustment, and the League will act as a permanent clearinghouse where every nation can come, the small as well as the great. Now, Woodrow Wilson would lead the commission to draft the League covenant. They met every day for about the next 10 days, pretty much lockstep with Woodrow Wilson's original ideas, maintaining that maximum leverage for the American president. Now, it was time to report out February the 14th, where Wilson came back to the full membership of the delegates of the conference. He read all 26 articles. He described the League Council. The council would be the most powerful part of this organization and be represented by the 9 most powerful countries in the world. These would be the voting members, and they must be unanimous in order to take action. The rest of the nations in the League would represent the Assembly. These would be mainly advisory participants, certainly active in all negotiations, but not really voting on the critical issues. And then there would be a secretariat that would be hired to kind of run things. The key to all of this, really, as you wiped away everything else, was Article 10, the Mutual Defense Pact, and that was also going to be the most controversial piece. This is what it said. The members of the League undertake to respect and preserve us as against external aggression, the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. In case any such aggression, or in case of any threat or danger of such aggression, the Council shall advise upon the means by which this obligation shall be fulfilled. The intent was economic pressure might come first, but a military response would be available from the members if such a violation occurred and if a unanimous vote took place in the Council. Now, for Woodrow Wilson, this was a combination of carrots and sticks to try to maintain the world order. He said that armed force is in the background in this program, but it is in the background. And if the moral force of the world will not suffice, the physical force of the world shall. But that is the last resort, because this is intended as a constitution of peace, not a league of war. But this would be the most controversial piece of the entire Treaty of Versailles and the League Covenant back in the United States, in the U.S. Senate, but Woodrow Wilson was paying no attention to that. He was determined to do the job and then expect the Senate would comply. Well, he'd have a chance to see for himself how things were playing out in the United States, because as President of the United States, he had a job to do that he had to do in person back home. It was the end of the congressional session. He needed to get back to sign bills, perhaps veto bills, and so as March the 3rd and 4th were closely arriving, as soon as he had introduced the Covenant of the League of Nations, it was time to leave. Now, these have been all difficult negotiations already underway with the other allies, talking about reparations, territorial claims, but in general, Wilson was pleased because he was getting in his mind the League of Nations. That covenant had been announced. If that could be adopted, things would be all right. But the president, again, was ready should be set for a rude awakening when he returned home, because the U.S. Senate was not really aligned. That's the story for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson and Peace Conference Round 1 from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.